Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm delighted to join you and our participants here in the room with us in Montreal today, and all of you who are watching the Economic Forum at home and wherever you are. I am absolutely delighted to have the opportunity today to be part of a panel that we're going to jump into very quickly. To discuss the future of sustainability and ESG. Market-based economies are being transformed globally as investors and citizens and consumers and governments are demanding action on sustainability environmentally and socially. In response to this demand, ESG is being embedded deeply into business and investment decisions. Business leaders like Bill Gates or Brookfield, BlackRock, and of course BMO are part of a global movement leading the charge to net zero. This isn't the first time that we have seen this kind of growing consensus on tackling climate change. Back in 2006, when Al Gore wrote his book, An Inconvenient Truth, and his documentary, at that time, there was a movement that actually gained a lot of traction on carbon pricing, leading up over the next several years to a point where even in the U.S. Congress, Republicans like Lindsey Graham and Susan Collins were sponsoring pieces of legislation to put a price on carbon. All of that progress was derailed with the global financial crisis in 2008. Now, today's ESG and sustainability movement is broader, is deeper, and is taking more action to tackle climate change than any of the previous efforts. Is this time really different? The COVID crisis has not, as yet, distracted business and capital markets away from the important work of tackling climate change and sustainability. But we're not out of the woods yet. In his book, Values, former governor of the Bank of Canada and Bank of England, and Brookfield Vice Chair Mark Carney argues that market economies have led to market societies, and he's among many who are calling for a realignment of market value to reflect societal values like social sustainability and environmental sustainability, as Mark leads the world to net zero at Glasgow. Is all this remarkable progress irreversible and resistant to financial shocks and other events that the world might throw at us in the coming months and years? How do we secure this progress and prevent backsliding? Today, we are joined by three experts, real leaders in ESG and sustainability, to share with us some examples of what their companies are doing to move the needle and to be part of the solution. We have Rachel Everard from RollsRoyce with us today. Welcome. Céline Yang from IKEA. And Joe Weddinging. I apologize. I hope I got that right. Weddinging from Nike. I guess I should just do it as it were. Sorry, I had to throw that in. I'd like to each of you please to provide some brief openings in terms of how your companies are viewing the priorities around sustainability, action you're taking, and also if you could reflect on whether COVID and the incredible impact of COVID on so many things, how it has affected your organization's views of sustainability and where you're putting your priorities. Certainly COVID has had the capacity to exacerbate inequalities in a number of ways and create situations and deepen problems that pre-existed. So I'll start perhaps with Rachel from Rolls-Royce, and there you are. If you could give us a little overview and touch on some of those subjects, and then we'll move on to our other experts and get into some questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Well, virtually, of course, here from London. But thank you. I think in terms of kind of our appetite for sustainability and the impact of COVID on corporate decision-making in response to sustainability, I absolutely think it's been an accelerator. What we've seen throughout the last 18 months is that we can adapt at pace when we need to. I think for every industry has been impacted by the pandemic, and particularly transport and power generation, where Rolls-Royce is very active. And despite that, has not kind of quelled our thirst or changed our kind of strategy. If anything, it's just accelerated the case for change, I think, and shown us that fundamental change is possible. And sometimes in the hardest of circumstances. I think what's really interesting for me is that we saw at a global scale the impact of the pandemic and the knock-on consequence of that in terms of global emissions was around about an 8% reduction in global CO2 emissions throughout last year. And we think about the socio-economic impact of that. Here in the UK, we were in lockdown, it felt, for an entire year. We weren't traveling anywhere. Industry was basically shut down. We weren't manufacturing. So the impact of that was profound. Yet we only achieved what we need to achieve every year if we want to hit the Paris Agreement goals by 2050. That's a terrifying fact, and it shows that we do need to all work together in partnership to make sure that we can actually deliver a more sustainable future. So at Rolls-Royce, certainly it has only accelerated our appetite to decarbonize the sectors that we're active in, and has also, I think, heightened our awareness of our social responsibilities as well, particularly for our workforce, but also for the communities in which we're active as well.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And now I'd like to hear from IKEA. I had, as long as I don't have to assemble anything, please have your arguments pre-assembled for the audience today. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I could just, of course, agree very much with the previous speaker. We are in the life at home business, home furnishing. And here we have a crisis where people are locked at home. And we have also seeing the lifestyles and people's well-being. So the presence and understanding of sustainability and sustainability questions, both the socioeconomic part as well as the environmental part, has been very clear. I don't see that there's different topics, but they have very much been amplified. Here all of a sudden you have a problem of breathing, and people are having air pollutions that are never been worse due to forest fires. You have a disease that requires washing hands, and people don't have clean water. And you have access of food that is not available for people. So I think with us, it's so clear that this needs to be accelerated. And sustainability now, the way we talk about it, is both the sprint activities that we need to focus on now that can't wait, but it's also a marathon. So in the corporate decision making, you have to be able to do both. You have to be able to know where you need to do the footprint, quick, fast movement here and now. And you also need to know what's going to happen beyond 2030. So I don't see that we're going to fall back, like you mentioned in the beginning. But I do see that there is a big need to know what you should focus on in the next 10 years. We can talk, and we need to talk about the marathon, but we all need to really collaborate on 2030. And I can see that in our business decisions. I see that the major thing now is investments is maybe in the long-term perspective. We actually look into where we should source in 2040 because we are also very much integrated into forestry and agriculture. But we are also having decision tools in our everyday decision. We have 9,500 products, and all of them, every time they get designed, need to go forward with the circular design principles, and they need to select the materials with the lowest footprint. So what I can see now with the corporate decision, as it was spoken about here, it is business decision. It's not sustainability in corporate decision. It is business decision if you're going to be part of the marathon. So very, very clearly an important factor right now in our business development and the ability to change.
Thank you, Lena. And now over to Nike. And I'm interested in what Nike is doing to tackle these issues in the long run, as it were. But beyond that, also I'd add to that, and follows on Lena's comment, a question I have. Specifically is, how important is it that the CEO, the people at the very top of the corporation, own the ESG agenda for their companies and understand it in and out and really do act as champions for it every day in how they approach their work and leadership? So please, Nike.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll start by reintroducing myself. I'm Noel Kinder. I lead sustainability.
I know.
Joe is one of my colleagues. So I'm officially the one who's on the hook for all of this with Nike. It's a great question, Scott. I think, to start off with, I just echo what both Lena and Rachel said. I mean, for us as a company, COVID has really accelerated the commitment to sustainability. I've been at Nike for 22 years, and this is a journey we've been on even predating my time at Nike. But we've redoubled our efforts as a result of COVID. I think if you look at some of the consumer data that's out there, particularly for our consumer cohort, those that are Gen Z and millennial, they were living through lockdowns and seeing the blue sky in cities where they live for the first time, frankly, in their lifetimes. And so I think for me, the observation is that for a lot of our consumers, it's underscored what's possible. That if we really lean in and do this work and do it in a way that's integrated, at least for us across our entire organization, that we have the ability to kind of write the end to this story. So for us, it's really meant recommitting to what we already committed to in 2016, which is the science. The Paris Climate Accords really guide our work, particularly on the carbon side. And we have structured our internal work, our organization, and frankly, all of our efforts within Nike, within our extended supply chain around that ambition of reducing our carbon footprint in line with the Paris Climate Accord. So I think, somebody mentioned the notion of focus. I think it was Lena. I think that's incredibly important. There's a lot, there are a lot of things that you can do. We really collectively need to focus on the few things that move the needle, so to speak. And to your point about sponsorship from the top, it's critical. And I think that goes all the way up to the board level. At Nike, we've been really fortunate to have a board committee that's committed to governing corporate responsibility and sustainability for more than 20 years now. And the commitment from our prior CEO, Mark Parker, who's now our executive chairman, and John Donahoe, who's our CEO now, can't be overstated. John, when he came in a little over a year ago, made sustainability one of his top 5 critical priorities for the company, alongside digital transformation and a number of other things. And so that endorsement is really, really important. Now, I will say that momentum was there regardless of John's endorsement, but to have him be that that enthusiastic and supportive of it, to include it in our strategic priorities, and to allow me as the leader of this space the freedom to deputize the company in every aspect has just continued that momentum and reinforced the commitment that we've had for so long.
Thanks very much, Noel. And I've got questions for Rachel and Lena, but just one thing you said there, and I want to follow up on it. You mentioned digital transformation as a priority for Nike, and I'd be interested in all your reflections on the linkage between digital transformation and sustainability, because clearly, as we are better connected digitally and able to communicate and do these sorts of panel discussions digitally, the carbon footprint for our activities and these conversations certainly takes a is a significant reduction. So I'd be interested in, and perhaps we can start with you, Noel, on that, and then I'm going to go over to Rachel and then Lena, and with some questions. So Noel, if you want to just touch on that whole digital transformation relationship with sustainability and ESG goals.
Yeah, you bet. It's a really good question. Of course, digital transformation has accelerated like no one anticipated prior to COVID, of course. For us, it's increased our digital commerce exponentially, frankly, over the last 18 months. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it allows us to do things like this. I don't have to get on a plane and go to Montreal, as much as that would be fun. It certainly allows me to engage with my peers across multiple industries, to share best practices, to engage with our employees all over the world much more easily and much more frequently, which I think is a really nice upside of what has been a really difficult year for the entire planet. And in the shift in business, it also transforms where your sustainability impacts are coming from. For us, we very quickly, as we went into the pandemic, looked very hard at how much product we put on a plane to transport it. And what's interesting, I think, for me about sustainability in the supply chain in particular is that you very quickly realize that things that are more sustainable are also more effective from a business standpoint. So in our case, while we use air freight on a very limited basis, it's really important for us to understand as we make decisions that it is roughly 42 times more carbon intensive to put product on a plane than on a boat, and it is about 15 times more expensive. And so those intersections of incentive become very, very clear as your business starts to transform, whether that's digitally or any other way. And I think as you're embedded, as you said early on, across the enterprise, then you have the opportunity to work with your peers, to work with your operational colleagues, to identify those spaces where, frankly, this makes really good sense for the business overall and helps you advance the objective toward your sustainability goals at the same time.
Great. Thanks, Noel. Rachel, how does Rolls-Royce view energy transition as an opportunity? And feel free to comment as well on the digital transformation question if you feel you have something to add to that too. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we see the energy transition as both a commercial imperative, but more importantly, the biggest societal risk and challenge and opportunity that we all face. And I think, as to Noel's point, sustainability and business opportunity goes hand in hand. It's certainly what we're seeing. And actually, if we can create opportunities for low or net zero carbon technologies that can differentiate us in the markets that we serve, which include air freight and transport, I should say, and data centers, then that's where the demand for increased power is coming from, particularly as we emerge from the pandemic, but also as we look across the world at economies that have not benefited from the same socioeconomic opportunities that we have here in the UK. We don't want to, people need to be able to have the same access. That's a huge part of the energy transition, and the climate challenge we face is really around how we can adapt at pace and be resilient without creating opportunity, or without kind of blocking opportunities for people, I think is the way I would think about it. But on the digital side, I think absolutely digital transformation has a critical role to play. We're not in the commerce business, and we're a B2B business, but if we look at digital transformation across our organization, we're using it across our manufacturing, we're using it across our products and service. So particularly things like digital twins and AI to help us in our manufacturing processes and in the use of our product to help us do things like predictive maintenance, support our circular economy goals, really help us to leverage our business and operating model to make sure that not only are we maximizing the value of our products and service, but we're actually minimizing any environmental impacts that are associated with having to replace parts or whole products. We know where the carbon intensive processes lie in our value chain, and things like extracting raw materials, producing high, we use a lot of critical metal alloys, which takes some pretty intensive processing to get to a jet engine. So if we can minimize that through the use of digital, then that's win-win for us and for our customers, but also more importantly for the planet.
Great. Thank you. Lena, your company has been, and IKEA has been for some time, a real leader in greener procurement around solar and wind and alternative energy. How do you view your role at IKEA as part of a market-making role to actually play a leading role in adopting clean technologies and helping be part of the solution by actually, from your procurement's perspective, helping advance and ultimately make more competitively available these kinds of technologies and approaches?
I think there's two sides of this, of course, and if we go back to the impact we have, we both look into our own supply chain, looking into what that means, which is huge. If we talk about the impact we have, the material transformation is actually the biggest one we can do. And there's technical innovation there too. Around 45% of our footprint is actually the material. And then we have, if you look at our global transport, it's about 4 to 5% of our climate footprint. Equally important, but it actually puts also another perspective into how you look into technology and where you actually put your effort. I would say that transform our business and take out the glue from the particle boards is bigger than if we actually change our transport system, which is amazing if you start to think about it. So maybe I'm not answering exactly what your question is, but I do think that there is some important part of changing your own business at the same time. But then that's our biggest ambition, to drastically reduce our climate footprint without carbon offsets. But then you also have the other part, which you just spoke about, beyond our own business, to be part of the market, to make it accessible for clean energy, is also an important part. In some cases, we can be a facilitator to make the access easier when it comes to solar panels. We can also make sure that when we work with renewable energy in countries where the infrastructure are not as developed yet, we can also be a partner in that and looking into it. We see that as an extremely important part. But I do think, and I want to focus on that too, that you need to drastically reduce your own footprint at the same time as you're working with the marketplace and investment and making it accessible for others.
Thanks, Lena. Also, how do each of you view the circular economy and opportunities in upping our game in terms of reusing and recycling and better managing our scarce resources? How do you view that circular economy opportunity? Start maybe with Noel, if you on that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really important lever. A few years back, one of our innovation teams gave themselves the brief to come up with the lowest carbon footprint shoe that we had made. And they really quickly discovered that the best way to do that was to use waste as a feedstock into that product. So to Lena's point about materials, we're the same ratio roughly as Lena laid out. Actually, if you include manufacturing, our carbon footprint is 80% driven by materials and manufacturing. And so the unlock that insight gave to the design process basically proved out exactly what the circularity proposition is intended to provide, which is if you can find ways to reuse material, and in our case, in that particular shoe, it was waste, you can drastically reduce the carbon footprint. We actually just released a shoe this week, the AlphaFly Next Percent, which was to plug maybe a little bit, a version of the shoe that Eliud Kipchoge broke the marathon in, that is the same principle. It uses recycled manufacturing waste as the platform for that product. And so I think it's incredibly important. I'm really excited about some of the technology that's out of there, whether that's chemical recycling of full garments or chemical recycling of components of footwear. That's absolutely game changing. I look forward to the day when a consumer can go to a Nike store or anybody's store for that matter and drop off an old pair of shoes or a garment and have it recycled back into something new. I'm really excited about the possibility of that.
Yeah. My spouse is actually excited about the idea of me throwing out some of my old Nike shoes as well. So that might actually work very well in our household. In terms of, I'd be interested in how IKEA views some of the circular economy. You mentioned you're no longer putting glue in your particle board. So Lena, help me understand what's holding together the particles. But I'm interested in how you view circular opportunities here.
We still have glue. It's just other types of glue.
I understand.
but I think that I would just second, of course, what Noel said just recently, that this is a big part of actually reaching the climate goal. But it also starts before even recycled materials, which I know that everybody's working on as well, just as IKEA. But it is prolonging the life of products. And we've changed the whole design concept around this, actually. So every product that we are designing now, they score on the circular score. And that means they have to have a renewable recycled materials. They're based on that. They should be possible to repair, and they need to be able to repurpose. And there's many of these different type of criteria, because of course, if you design a paper napkin or a kitchen, the formula for a circular product looks a little bit different. But this is the whole purpose of the circular engine, is to make sure that we can reduce the climate footprint, be more resource efficient. It's sort of resource efficiency 2.0. But it goes from everything from the beginning. Link it to the design process in the beginning to make sure that you also know the life length of the product, how you prolong the life of the product, and then at the very end, of course, make sure that it can be recycled. So we have a long journey in some cases, but we have also come to some cases quite far in using recycled materials, for example. So I see that as a pivotal part of transforming into a sustainable business.
So materials and circular economy priorities seem to apply a lot in the B2C or the consumer side with Nike and IKEA. I'd be interested in how RollsRoyce in your business model and you're part of RollsRoyce, how you view that. So, Rachel.
Yeah, it's a great question, because the circular economy and circularity has been a part of our business model for a really long time, long before I was at the organization, and long before we realized it was a sustainability benefit. It was very much driven by business benefit. You think that we are processing, as I said, large chunks of metal alloys, which have, a lot of raw critical materials in there. Some of them are pretty rare, and some of them are very valuable. We want to maintain the maximum value of that and keep it ultimately flying in the air pre-COVID for as long as possible. So yeah, this is something we've been looking at for a really long time, and we can today recycle 99% of a aero engine. About 50% of that can be recycled, and we can guarantee the origin and the quality of the material so much that it can actually be reused back into an aero engine. The quality of the material is so high, it maintains its aerospace grade, which is fantastic for us. The rest of it may be downgraded. It usually ends up in kind of titanium watches and golf clubs. So they could be potentially parts of our aerospace engines in some of there, if that's your hobbies. But I think for us, as I said, it's a fantastic sustainability benefit. It really complements our sustainability narrative, but it also has significant business benefits. It reduces our need to procure raw materials with cost benefit to that, but as well as the kind of socioeconomic environmental impact of having to procure raw materials, as I said. And I think it also helps to drive, as Lena said, we're designing for the environment throughout every stage of the product life cycle. We're making sure that we can access the parts that we need to. We're now looking at how we can make sure that instead of having to completely take apart an engine to replace a very small part right in the core of it, actually we can do some really cool stuff with little robotics that looks like beetles and snakes and things to go right into the engine and be able to just do a little bit of welding or a little bit of whatever it might be to repair it, to keep that engine in service for longer, which is fantastic for our sustainability programs, as well as our business programs. It helps keep our customers happy if their engine's available and not in the shop for maintenance all the time. But it helps also to drive our business forwards. And we've been talking, as a RollsRoyce for quite some time now about a concept, called Power by the Hour. So an increasingly service-driven business model that is linked to our circularity and sustainability strategy is where we're looking at potential significant growth opportunities that align really well with our net zero carbon ambitions.
Very good. How important are government policy decisions and signals? For instance, we understand that carbon pricing has played an important role in terms of driving change in corporate decision making. But beyond carbon pricing, how important do you view government policy and as in terms of its impact on the decision making that your corporation is taking? And I'll start maybe with, why don't we start with Lena this time?
I think it's extremely important. What we see today is, of course, that all of the goals that we have set out to do, we can't do by ourselves. There is no one single business or government that can solve all these problems by themselves. So the importance to have a language that everybody recognizes, have ambitions that we are agreeing on is extremely important. And I also see all the infrastructure changes that is needed also when you are doing these changes. Everything from, the whole secondhand material flows to how we build into, different type of service systems and technology, as we spoke about. And here is a clear role also for government to facilitate and support and have and work together on these topics. So it's not one partner here that is that could be missing. And I think there we see a lot of positive trends into this and a lot of discussions, but of course there needs to be even more.
Thank you. Now, I'd be interested in how Rachel views this as well as Noel, but I'd also like you to think, in addition to the role of governments, the role of consumers and investors, we know, is very important. In your view, is it investors who are driving this more so than consumers, or are consumers driving it, or is it a virtuous circle where citizens, whether they're consumers or investors, are thinking about this, or their kids are thinking about it and telling them to change and they're listening? Is this the most unified movement we've seen to tackle sustainability in terms of government, business, citizens, and consumers? And who do you, is it all of the above that are driving this, or do you really see that consumers are playing in your individual companies? Is it more consumers or investors? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, and we'll go over to Rachel, please.
Yeah, thank you. Reflecting on the point, I think no company is an island, and we all have to work in collaboration here, and that involves both our customers, our investors, policymakers, probably perhaps one of the most important in terms of setting the environment in which we operate and creating that landscape for us. But I think they all have a combination of carrot and stick that can help drive us forward here. I think for me, like I said, not coming from a consumer-facing organization, it's quite difficult to focus on that. But it's something we have certainly seen in the transport industry more generally, in terms of that increased demand for low-carbon alternatives. So we're seeing increased kind of personal choice playing a factor here. And I think it'll be interesting to see as the travel industry recovers from the pandemic, how much that is a factor in people's decision to travel. And we've all seen the benefits of not having to hop on flights all the time to get to business meetings. But I think we've also seen some of the kind of social elements that we've missed out on through not being able to connect with people, whether that's friends, family, or business colleagues. I would love to be in Montreal for this session personally, but I think in terms of kind of what's driving us from a RollsRoyce perspective, it's a combination of all the individuals and stakeholders you set out. And I also wouldn't underestimate the role of our workforce as well. Something I have been quoted as saying a few times is I might have the pleasure of having the title head of sustainability, but it's absolutely something that every single person in our organization is driven by, committed to, and has to help contribute to if we actually want to achieve what we're trying to achieve here. And I think that's true across society. It's not limited to one organization for sure.
Thanks, Rachel. Noel, for you, from your perch at Nike, do you believe that what's really driving Nike's sustainability? Is it coming from the investor side or which is the stronger force driving and reinforcing your sustainability decisions? Is it coming from the investor community or is it coming from consumers now? Which would be probably greatest?
I think it really comes from our historic commitment to it. I mean, I was fortunate to step into a role that was built on a platform of 20 years of work against sustainability. And so that is really kind of the commitment to do that work is really what is the strongest guide for us. But there's no doubt that consumer sentiment is a huge accelerant for that. Our consumers care deeply about this. As everybody pointed out, nearly everyone does now, including investors. And so the shift in focus, the shift in attention, the urgency around this issue is an accelerant to the work that we've been doing for multiple decades now, which frankly makes my job a little bit easier. I think Rachel's point about the workforce, our employees, all 75,000+ of them, is a huge constituency and a really, really important one. They care deeply about this as well, and they have very high expectations for what they expect us as a brand to accomplish in this space. Again, great tool, resource for me to leverage. I used the term deputize earlier. I'm really fortunate to be able to rely on that passion, energy, and enthusiasm, not only from the top, but from the rank and file of the organization to drive the agenda that we've set forth. And to your point about investors, they're an incredibly important constituency as well. They have very high expectations, as they should, of brands like ours and what we intend to achieve. And more, those expectations are quantifiable, right? It's not just do better anymore. It's tell me really specifically what you're doing to accomplish these goals. Nearly all of us, all three of us, of course, on this call have very specific ambitions that we want to achieve certain things, whether that's science-based targets or waste reduction, whatever that may be. And I think one of the important roles investors play are helping hold us accountable for those commitments and having the conversations, educating themselves on in our industry, our respective industries, what are we doing? What are the levers we can pull to advance those objectives?
Thank you. I'd be interested in all of your perspectives on how consumers and investors can understand better whether a company is greenwashing or is taking substantive, tenable and action on sustainability, because everybody today, is from a marketing perspective pushing sustainability. So how does a consumer and how do investors separate the wheat from the chaff in terms of understanding whether this is, signaling green or doing green are two different things, and walking, how do they know that a company is really walking the walk as opposed to just talking the talk? So we'll start with Lena this time, please.
I think it's super important. And also, if you're an investor, of course, today we have the frameworks of science-based targets, and we have formal standards that you can report according to. You report annually, and you show the progress and your failures and what you're trying to improve. The more we can harmonize some of those frameworks on how to report, I think the easier it is also to be able to communicate this, because these are very complex areas. When it comes to customers, you're onto something that I think is one of the most difficult things to communicate, because the complexity of a product is so many. And at the same time, we think about, the many people that we are reaching. They pretty much wake up in the morning, they want to, go to work, they go to school, hopefully now after the pandemic, and eat and sleep. And they have thousands of decisions to make every day, whether they buy a toothbrush or they buy a bed or a kitchen. What is the ability to take in all this information? So we also see this as a challenge. Then we want to make sure that when we talk about our products, we talk very specifically about what it means. If it is the material, if it is the solution, we have both the solutions to help people live a more sustainable life at home, whether it's water saving solutions or energy saving solutions or access to renewable energy. So I think as a customer today, there is a lot of pressure to make lots of decisions. And therefore, I think companies have an even bigger responsibility to show the progress in totality. So with this, it comes with lots of information, of course, but I do think that that is the most important part, to make sure that you are speaking about exactly what you're talking about, rather than you talk about a sustainable product. You talk about, this is a water saving solution and this is the material. But it is a dilemma to talk to customers, I think, with so much information that is needed. At the same time, you need to do it as a company.
Well, speaking of just do it, how does Nike view this from a perspective of if Nike has, for instance, produces products that are lower carbon footprint than competitors and has a differentiated approach to that, how do you communicate that, and how can consumers tell between companies that are actually, well, just doing it versus just talking it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Lena made a really good point. Some level of standardization, I think, is a really important place to start. And science-based targets, because it's in line with the Paris Climate Accord, because it's largely in line with the science, is a bit of a unifying factor. And so that's why we've used that to really guide our work. And that ambition, that science-based target for us as a company cascades through every part of the organization. And so to your point about product, our product teams know what materials they need to adopt that are lower carbon so that we can then achieve those science-based targets over the longer term. Our operations and logistics teams know what they need to do in terms of alternative fuels to ensure their contribution to that target. Our manufacturing teams are the same, materials teams, et cetera. And so I think it's really important to anchor your work in the science first and foremost, but then to Lena's point, you have to explain the how, not just the what. And so I'm sure both RollsRoyce and IKEA have reports that they put out annually, as do we, that details what the work is that we're doing in support of those kind of broader ambitions. And I think that's the distinction, right? Anybody can have an ambition. Anybody can put out a statement. I think where we have an obligation, regardless of the three of us here, any major company has an obligation to explain how you're doing, both good and bad. To Lena's point, this is really complicated work. It's really challenging. There will be setbacks, no doubt about it. But I think the point of all of this is to set ambitious goals, set them in line with science, explain to the world how you're doing against them, even maybe when you take a step backward. And maybe to piggyback on the comment Lena made some time ago, collaborate, whether that's the three of us collaborating with each other, me collaborating with my competitors in my industry, or looking outside of our industry to technology and companies like Apple. I think that will be a really important path forward in order for us to achieve what collectively we need to achieve.
Great. Rachel, how do investors, how sophisticated do you believe investors are today, and the investor community, capital markets, around the differentiating between greenwashing and real action to tackle climate change? Sustainability reports have been a big advancement, but not all sustainability reports are created equally. And do investors have the right tools, and are they asking the right questions to understand fully how substantive a sustainability report really is versus a communications or marketing document?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think it comes back to both Lena and Noel commented on standardization, kind of cutting through. How do you cut through the noise? It's such a noisy environment. There's so many different expectations and requirements and questionnaires that I could spend my entire life just responding to ESG questionnaires, but wouldn't get anything done, but I could. And I think for us, we've been very targeted with where we respond to, who we respond to, and why, and making sure that we're really considering what's most material to us. And when we're looking at our sustainability communications, it's also based on our materiality assessment. So we're not talking about things that are just, that might be important to an organization that operates in a very different sector or space, but just aren't that material to us and the impacts that we have as an organization. That's taken a lot process to get to a point where we feel that our approach is mature enough to make those sorts of decisions. And it can sometimes lead to some pretty difficult conversations with investors who want to understand why you're not reporting a certain metric or a certain impact. But I think once you can explain the nuances, it really does move you forward and demonstrates your kind of a maturity in this space. I also think, a lot of the time we're looking to make informed decisions, and data can drive informed decisions. And something we're seeing increasingly is the use of kind of AI tools in ESG screenings, and something I think is going to be a massive trend going forward to try and, as you say, cut the wheat from the chaff and pull out the real pertinent points of information where we can back that up with, AI and including things like I've seen satellite verification stuff to make sure that actually the impacts that we're claiming or we're reporting are verified and credible and hit an assurance standard. And I think that's where things like the SBTI is moving forward with their new standard that's coming out later this year, is really around that verification piece. And I think that's going to be a very interesting shift in the landscape here in terms of sustainability reporting. Here in the UK, we've kind of seen that with things like the TCFD becoming part of our mandatory disclosure requirements. That is driving or changing the conversation slightly with things like our auditors. I actually don't produce a sustainability report because my personal information is within my financial report and accounts. So we don't produce a separate PDF. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's quite different, I think. We look at what we put on the website, which is then optimized for AI. And we look at really putting that important information in our mainstream reporting. And I think that perhaps is a shift we're seeing in this space.
Great. Most of the discussion today has been on environmental sustainability. And we know that COVID has driven a deepening of pre-existing inequalities. Those who entered the COVID period privileged, in many cases became more privileged during COVID and wealthier, and those who entered COVID disadvantaged, in many cases became more disadvantaged. And we're also told that there's been significant dislocation of workers. Women have struggled in this environment. And there could be a lot more dislocation as digitization and AI and robotics, play a greater role for companies going forward. So how do your companies view other types of sustainability and areas like living wage, inequality, diversity and inclusion? The focus seems to be largely on the E part of ESG. So can we move over to the S part of it and hear what your companies are doing on that side of it and how you view that in terms of priorities going forward? And we will start with Noel this time.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, it's an incredibly important question. And I think in simple terms, the S, as you said, is co-equal with the E, particularly given the circumstances. I mean, first and foremost, whether it's within our partner relationships out in our supply chain or with our own employees out in our retail doors or in our distribution centers, focusing on their health and safety first and foremost was the tip of the spear over the course of the last 18 months. But given the unprecedented circumstances, I think we actioned against exactly some of the challenges that you described by virtue of pay continuity for all of our retail workers when the lion's share of our retail stores were shut down across the planet. And so I think it speaks to the need to integrate what we would call purpose, so both the E and the S and the G, across the entirety of your enterprise, in your relationships with your employees, in your relationships with your vendors, with your partners, and ensuring that you are integrating those values into all of the decisions that you make, regardless of location, regardless of circumstance, regardless of relationship that you may have. It absolutely is core to what we do. And actually within Nike, we've structured purpose very deliberately such that I own the environmental side of that. I have a peer who owns the diversity, equity, and inclusion component of that, and another peer who owns the community investment component. And we are, in fact, our purpose leadership team and act effectively as a unit to tackle all of those things across the entirety of our enterprise, up and down the supply chain and out into our retail environment.
Right. Thank you, Noel. And Lena, come on.
Yeah, I go back to what I mentioned in the beginning. I mean, you need to look at short-term impact and long-term marathon impact as well. And during the COVID situation, I think the crisis management around the inequalities has been very, very clear. To understand both within your own business, but also in your supply chain, where people have really had a challenging time. And we've actually mobilized a lot of work to make sure that we are inclusive and supporting where the pain has been the most. And that means knowing who you are interacting with and knowing who could be in social entrepreneurship, for example. We've had many social entrepreneurs that have had a challenging time, and we also have people in different regions and stores that have been closed. So there is absolutely a big part of the social side of the sustainability job and work that we're doing. But then also, I think looking into inclusive design in we look into the whole aspect of life at home. So how do we include more people in the home and access to home? How do we make sure that we have an inclusive workforce that is diverse? It goes across the whole business, I would say. Then we did talk about standardizations and measurement, which is maybe not as easy in this area. Measuring impact is what we have been talking a lot about, and this is something we want to do, but we also want to be sensitive. I mean, we're talking about people and improving and impacting people's life. So I would say that there is equally focus on the social side as the environmental side, but when we start to talk about climate, it's easy to stay within the sort of environmental E side of it. But of course, climate impact is hugely a social question as well.
Yeah. Now, one of the reasons why we perhaps are seeing more traction on the climate side is that today, with carbon footprint methodology, measurement methodologies, we probably have a better ability to measure and as such manage some of those things. Rachel, as you speak to the social sustainability side, are there areas here where we should be finding ways to quantify progress on the social side? And to Lena's point on suppliers, does RollsRoyce, for instance, research carefully from a supplier perspective on issues beyond the environmental, for instance, things like living wage, diversity and inclusion, sustainable social policy, supporting communities, what have you? I'd be interested in RollsRoyce's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think echo what both Lena and Noel said. I think certainly the point of environmental and social sustainability kind of going hand in hand, absolutely something we feel. And I guess we do focus on net zero, on a climate action and decarbonisation. We are a company with a pretty significant carbon footprint, but absolutely recognise that we actually can't achieve our strategy for decarbonising if we don't have those other factors in place. We're not a diverse and inclusive organisation if we don't have fair standards of labour in our supply chain. We don't provide a safe place of work. So they absolutely do go hand in hand. I think to your question in terms of kind of measurement, it is much harder, as Lena said, when you're talking about people and you're talking about human lives and you're talking about the impact that you have, good or bad. It can be much harder to kind of standardize how do you measure that in terms of a ton of CO2 looks the same kind of anywhere in the world. Actually, the impact of a flight or a job or a education course is very different on an individual level. So I think it is hard to measure, but it comes back to trying to make informed decisions. And what we're trying to do ultimately is be a responsible and a resilient business. I think every organization is trying to achieve those goals. And if by having more information and being able to understand where we're really having that positive impact that we're trying to achieve, I think absolutely measurement is going to be really key. It's just not quite clear at the moment how we do that.
Great. Is there greater, measurement is important. How important is reportage on things like diversity and inclusion within companies? If you don't, you can't manage what you don't measure, and success is not necessarily where you're at, it's how far you've gone from where you started. But in individual companies, is there a potential for greater standardization around reportage around some of the social sustainability metrics? And, is this an area, is this part of what we need to turn our attention to? Not that climate change is something we've already dealt with, but I think that people today, citizens, are expecting us to walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of dealing with both the social imperatives and the environmental ones. So do you see potential for advancement in a more standardized approach on social sustainability?
I think it's a really difficult space. There are legal frameworks to consider. We can't ask the same questions of people in our workforce in Germany as we can in the UK. But also, I think it comes down to not wanting to put people in boxes either. I wouldn't necessarily want to, to help have people have to define things in that way. I think we look at trying to be a inclusive workforce, and we think about what that means for us and what it means for the people that are working with us or working for us or partnering with us. And I think we can do that in a way that doesn't necessarily require us to measure and monitor all the time, but to think about the kind of culture that we embody in the workplace that we create. But I do, on the flip side, also think transparency is absolutely key. And being honest about your mistakes and honest about the sort of company that you are. We hear a lot about kind of corporate values and things, and I think that's all great. But actually, how do you live up to the values that you set out as an organization? And that's really how people are going to make decisions about who they work for or who they work with. Is what it really feels like to work at RollsRoyce or at Nike. It's not maybe what my slogan is. And I think that's where we're really focusing our efforts. But that's a very hard thing to start to measure and monitor.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to give the opportunity to each of you to bring a very brief closing, potentially, although I think we only have about a minute left. So perhaps, actually, I'll turn it over to you for a brief closing on what you think. First of all, on net zero, how optimistic are you about Glasgow? And what should we be looking for in terms of indicators of success and traction coming out of Glasgow? Turn it over to let me see, Noel first, and then quickly followed by Lena and Rachel.
Sure, I'll be brief. Look, I'm super optimistic. Like we've talked about the momentum that the issue of climate change has, the collective energy that we have as a planet around solving this. And in so much as Glasgow represents an opportunity for all those constituencies that both Lena and Rachel mentioned, government, corporations, nonprofits, et cetera, to come together and collaborate on solutions, then I'm optimistic. I think we all realize that this is an existential crisis now. We're no longer talking about whether or not it's real. We're talking about what the solutions are that we need to move forward.
Great stuff. Lena?
I fully agree with Noel. I also think that it's what happens between the COP meetings that also is the most important part. So super important that we come together, that we work together, and I'm very optimistic about that. But what I see is also the work that is now happening in between, and that I see as the most optimistic trend at the moment.
Great. Rachel, are you going to continue this string of optimism, or are you going to be a real downer on this and leave us all saddened and pessimistic about the future? Just no pressure, but.
No, I think we all have to be optimistic. I think it's our jobs to be optimistic as sustainability leaders, because our jobs are to be catalysts for change, positive change.
Great.
I'm particularly excited about Glasgow. I'm looking forward to being there, but I also think Glasgow is not just about Glasgow or about COP. Glasgow is everybody's business. And as Lena and Noel said, we all have to come together to tackle these challenges. We will only be successful if we collaborate here across sectors, across industries. And as individuals. So that's what I'm excited about and optimistic for.
Well, you three are all excited and optimistic, and I'm excited and optimistic about Glasgow and moving forward. And let's keep focused on all of us and companies, business, but also government and the civil society, and most importantly, citizens, in demanding change, demanding action from governments, corporations, and investors. Thank you very much, each of you, for your leadership on sustainability in your companies and for setting an example for corporations and organizations to raise the bar and to really tackle some of these issues. And we're looking forward to seeing some of you actually physically in Montreal, perhaps next year. And in the meantime, good luck with your important work as we build a prosperity at the same time that we build sustainability. And this is a very hopeful conversation led by 3 real experts who are indeed walking the walk for their companies on behalf of all of us as citizens of this planet. So thank you very much to each of you for your work and your leadership and for joining us today.